So in this interview, I speak to Michael Tracey, everything Trump from his campaign, his backers, his administration, his Gaza policy, his Ukraine policy, and then just more critical of the media space around Trump and his campaign, where he didn't really have to answer any serious questions like most US presidents don't. They never really ask them serious questions, but he went onto podcasts with comedians, more of the alternative media route, which was interesting, where he didn't really get criticized properly. So this interview is very critical on some of Trump's policies and the space around him, and more his kind of die-hard following, like with any political force. There's ones who are blind to everything. But I'm kind of just doing this intro because I don't want to put off people who think I'm just plainly going after Trump and not being fair with other presidents. I actually prefer him on an international foreign policy level. Like, I'm from England, I don't know domestically what he does there, but from a foreign policy perspective, I see him as much better than pretty much most previous presidents, especially the Biden administration and others. He's a billionaire, but he's not really in the Washington club when it comes to politics and foreign policy. He did try and do some good things in the first administration, speaking to Kim Jong Un in North Korea, which I think is a positive thing. They're a nuclear power like Russia. I think it's good to try and have some sort of relationship rather than this weird, we don't negotiate with terrorists mindset. He tried to pull out of Syria and other places in the Middle East. He didn't start a new war. I mean, he was pretty close with his assassination of Soleimani in Iran. And he does try and do some positive things. With this new administration, there are some positives of some of the people he's tried to put in. He pulled out of the WHO. You may not agree, but personally, I do think that's a good thing. I don't really care for the WHO, especially through COVID. He's not really a net zero guy. Neither am I. I mean, I'm well open to, starting to use renewable energies and investing in that and moving away from oil once it's ready. But I'm just not really fully on board with the whole agenda around it. It seems like new ways to make money, cost of living kind of rises, standard of living going down. Whether humans have an effect on the planet warming, I'm open to that. But the whole net zero through agenda, not really for me. But I just wanted to say this so I didn't put off everyone. I mean, I think Trump could do a lot better. I don't think he's that invested. With trying to pull out of Syria, he could have gone for it. Could have just said, with Afghanistan, Iraq, this is all George Bush's and Obama's fault. We're getting out of here. Kind of what he's done or trying to do, hopefully, with Ukraine, where he's kind of blamed it all on the Biden administration. He could have done that before, he didn't. So there's some good things there, but there's just a lot of bad things from Trump. I think he'd be better with Russia. I don't know about China, don't know about South America. There was clear attempts. They tried to overthrow Venezuela before. There was plans drawn up to assassinate Julian Assange. But I think he will be better with Russia, with Israel and Iran. He runs on this America First campaign, and he doesn't want to get in these Middle East entanglements. But he's the most pro-Israel president ever. He says that. Israel says that. They love him. He's probably going to give them the West Bank. He wants to move everyone out of Gaza. That's only going to lead to more Middle Eastern wars. As we saw recently, it was very close. Regional war with Iran, Hezbollah, now the Houthis in Yemen. So I just don't know what to think there. But anyway, I don't want to go on too long with this intro. I think Michael Tracey is a very fair, balanced person. If you read his tweets, follow his work, you never really see he's got a bias. Everything we speak about is kind of what Trump says and the administration and the facts, and a lot of information people didn't know, like Trump being intimately involved in getting through the bill in Congress and the Senate that gave Ukraine the most money it ever had, with the 50 billion not too long ago. So I don't want to go on too long. Just watch the interview, try and take in what we actually said rather than just thinking we're bashing Trump. Enjoy. Welcome to the Truth of a Comfort Show. Today's guest is Michael Tracey, who is an independent journalist who's also written for many mainstream outlets over the years. He's here to talk about everything Trump, from his campaign, his backers, his administration, his Gaza policy, his Ukraine policy, and then they're just kind of the media sphere around him. But it's great to have you on today, Michael. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Happy to be with you.
Great. Yeah, so as I was kind of saying before, I've been watching a lot of you, following you, and you are a critic, let's say, of Trump's followers, his base, and kind of his campaign and the media sphere, where he just wasn't really challenged on anything. He puts out these one-liners like, Putin would have never invaded. I'll have a deal in 24 hours. We now know that's not true. And things like Hamas would never have attacked, which is, I don't know, I don't really understand that one at all. And just generally his campaign of no one really questioning him much on anything. He obviously did lots of interviews with podcasters who, I'm not going to have a go at people like Joe Rogan and Theo Von. They're not the types, but they should probably, with the platform, be asking more crucial questions. But there's a lot to get into. We are now into his presidency, so we can see some of this unravel, like his Gaza plan, moving them into Egypt or Jordan, and everything that he wasn't questioned on. And we do have the current talks going on with Russia and the US, which is massively scaring Europe and the UK. But there's a lot to get into, so I'm happy for you just to kind of go where you think's best to start, and we can just kind of go from there, because we are kind of into the start of it, but I know there's a lot to get into before. So just go wherever you think's best.
Right. So you mentioned that during the extremely long, tediously long 2024 presidential campaign, which actually lasted formally for 2 years, because Trump officially announced his 2024 campaign right after the 2022 midterms. And he was effectively running even well before that. So there was a long period in which his plans for a second administration ought to have been scrutinized. And yet, when it came to the two most consequential foreign policy issues, his campaign pledge basically amounted to a series of counterfactual assertions. So, war in Ukraine never would have happened, and October 7th or the war in Gaza never would have happened. Now, that may be true, that may be not true, but it's impossible to prove. It's counterfactual. It's inherently unprovable. And therefore, my point throughout the entire campaign was that simply is not a sufficient window into what his tangible policy program would be were he to become president again. And so therefore, presumably, you would hope the onus falls on the media to probe him for more specifics about how those counterfactual, basically meaningless statements would translate into actual policy. And take a look at what it's now translated to with respect to Gaza. You'd be hard-pressed to argue to me that Trump randomly decided, he had like a sudden epiphany in the past 2 or 3 weeks, that his solution to the Gaza conflict would be for the U.S. to take it over and turn it into some kind of ill-defined U.S. military protectorate. Like, if that was the plan, wouldn't you have ideally wanted that to be at least expressed or espoused during the campaign so that it could be evaluated? And I don't know, maybe even the voters could be consulted about whether they wanted to set up some kind of protectorate in Gaza. I mean, the most maybe volatile part of the entire world, or at least one of them, coming under the control of the U.S. as some kind of, I don't know, colonial possession. We don't have the full specifics about what that would entail, but it's now been adopted by Netanyahu's government in Israel as his advocated outcome. Now, when that policy was pronounced during Trump's first meeting with a foreign leader, which of course was Netanyahu at the White House, you heard a lot of people saying, oh, this is just an opening negotiating gambit. And the refrain that I enjoy the most is a lecture that everybody needs to go back and reread, The Art of the Deal, so they can understand how genius this negotiating gambit really is. And I actually have read The Art of the Deal because I feel it's kind of incumbent upon everyone to abide by that request and actually go and read it. And I don't know if you've read it, but The Art of well, it's a 1987 business advice book that Trump had ghostwritten for him. Basically, the interviewer or the author interviewed Trump and kind of picked up his nomenclature and then fed that into a book-sized kind of treatise on Trump's philosophy in real estate. And it goes through uh, real estate deals that he had been involved with, whether in New York City or Atlantic City and other places. And the signature achievement in that book is how he ended up getting ownership over what's called the Wollman Rink, which is an ice skating rink in Central Park. And then because he worked out a deal with the New York City government to revive and refurbish the Wollman Rink. Okay, fine. That happened in the 1980s. Perhaps Trump really did do a brilliant job negotiating around the Wollman Rink, but the idea that neatly translates into the Gaza situation probably is a bit of a stretch. Like, I don't know how much insight you could find in The Art of the Deal that would explain how it's a great idea for the United States to take on Gaza as some sort of military protectorate, rename it as Gaza Lago, perhaps, and put in a bunch of casinos and hotels. Oh, and by the way, in the process, somehow forcibly expel 1.8 million Palestinian inhabitants. Like, The Art of the Deal from 1987 doesn't give a great deal of insight into that. But the broader point that I've been trying to hammer home is that this would have been something that a healthy media probably could have extracted from Trump during the campaign, which again was tediously long. And he addressed the Israel issue and the Ukraine issue, which we'll get into many, many times. But almost always it was this extremely unilluminating refrain about how it just never would have happened in this counterfactual, unprovable scenario. So yeah, I do think that does suggest a pretty severe media failure. And the media failure in this case, which is somewhat unique to 2024, does rest on the shoulders of the alternative media ecosystem that exponentially increased in prominence in 2024. Because Trump, not entirely, but largely circumvented the more traditional media. And I have plenty of criticisms of traditional or, quote, mainstream media. And I have for many years, including in relation to their coverage of Trump, which in the first term genuinely was always like constantly fever pitched and hyperbolic, particularly around the issue of quote unquote Russian interference or what came to be known as Russiagate. So there's a grudge there that does have some legitimate basis in terms of why Trump and his operation would have been inclined to circumvent the more traditional media. But then their landing spot is this so-called alternative media who don't have a whole lot of, I'm sorry to say, journalistic acumen. Not that everybody on earth has to be a journalist, right? But if you're dealing with a incredibly powerful politician who's poised to retake the presidency, you would hope that there could be some minimal journalistic inquiries leveled. And there really was not in the many podcasts and talk radio interviews and so forth that Trump did. Hence, we're now in a situation where this incredibly audacious plan, audacious is putting it charitably, to take over Gaza is just being sprung on the public only after he's taken power. So to me, that is a failure of the media. And then you couple that with these wider apparent plans for broad scale territorial acquisitions. Like maybe Canada is just a big joke, but it's a joke that's been repeated many, many times now. And it doesn't seem like Trump is particularly full of laughter when he makes this supposed joke. So is it just a negotiating gambit? I don't know. I mean, there's no way for us to see into the future and know that for sure it's a negotiating gambit, right? I mean, Trump obviously is highly empowered now, at least compared to the first term, has much more political capital to expend as he sees fit, has a much more compliant and submissive Congress, and has a media environment that's shifted such that these more, sorry to say, sycophantic outlets are much less inclined to challenge him, even substantively. Like I agree that a lot of the challenging, quote unquote, that had been done in the past was kind of supercilious, and not necessarily conducive to illuminating actual problems with the Trump tenure. But you need some kind of check on presidential power. And so for the media ecosystem to have been scrambled such that any real checks can now be almost entirely bypassed, I think is a bit worrisome. So I don't know, Canada, Panama, Greenland, Gaza. I mean, it probably would have been helpful to know that these apparent annexation aspirations were in the works before the election, and that just was never sussed out. So I think that's a big problem with the media's posture toward Trump and the wider political climate. And then on Ukraine, which there are negotiations or a negotiating framework that's now been established today as we're talking. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, along with Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, and Steve Witkoff, who's a special envoy, were in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, for the first direct meeting with senior level Russian officials in several years, over 3 years now. And that obviously is, I think, much preferable to the Biden administration's posture of totally foregoing any semblance of diplomacy for 3 years with the world's most heavily armed nuclear power. I mean, it's pretty straightforward and simple. And I think the idea that Trump would seek to resume relations with Russia was foreseeable based on his campaign rhetoric. So that's something that hasn't been hidden. But as with so many other things, the devil really is in the details in terms of how that's all going to shake out. It's one thing to resume direct contacts with Russian leadership, which I think is trivially necessary, or it should be seen as trivially obvious for that to be a sensible thing to do. But then the parameters of how some sort of cessation of hostilities will come about in Ukraine also need to be scrutinized, because as part of this negotiating framework, what we've heard from Trump himself at times, kind of haphazardly or imprecisely, is that, and then even Vance said this when he was at the Munich Security Conference last week, that the U.S. is going to attempt to employ various kinds of coercive leverage over Russia, which could include forms of military coercion. So there's a chance. I mean, nobody can say for sure, but there's a chance that there could even be potentially some kind of escalation if the negotiations break down. Now, I'm not going to assign any particular odds to that because it's impossible to know, but I just think people ought to be a little more clear-sighted over like what the policy was, and it just wasn't fleshed out over the course of the campaign. Because with Trump, especially because he's been on the political scene now for a long time, he was nominated 3 times by a major party for president, which is almost unprecedented, at least in American history, but definitely is in more modern history. His core supporters don't even have any expectation for him to reveal any plans, really, or they don't think that he should be asked for them to be revealed, because they just place their unabiding trust in him as a personage, and then that's what satisfies them. And I just don't think that's a healthy attitude toward any to take toward any political official. And then on Ukraine, I'll just wrap up here for now. uh, you saw a slew of headlines last week over the past maybe 10 days, week or so, about Trump first having a phone call with Putin, and then the remarks that were made by Vance and others at the security conference in Munich, and then today, this meeting in Riyadh. And as always, you can kind of divine whatever narrative you want from this based on the way you look at it. I mean, I didn't see many headlines last week over Trump confirming, in his own words, that U.S., quote, aid to Ukraine will continue. And Scott Bessent, who's the U.S. Treasury Secretary, became the first Trump administration official to visit Ukraine and said in Kyiv that pursuant to this new economic cooperation agreement, which is an interesting euphemism, with Ukraine for the U.S. to have a license over Ukrainian rare earth minerals, the U.S. will continue providing aid to Ukraine. And then Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary in Munich, also reaffirmed that the military aid, and I don't even like the word aid because I feel like it's a ridiculous, that itself is a ridiculous euphemism. It kind of makes you think of a first aid kit when it's really like a howitzer heavy artillery system or something. But anyway, Hegseth said that aid is going to continue. Now, we don't know the exact time frame over which those disbursements of U.S. quote-unquote aid will continue, but I don't know. I just think a lot of people were very confused, would have been confused, I think, baselessly during the 2024 campaign if you told them that, oh, when Trump takes office, he is going to continue aid to Ukraine. Like, a lot of people thought that couldn't possibly happen, right? But it's now happening according to senior administration officials, and it was also pretty foreseeable because Trump is never, as far as I know, on principle opposed U.S. aid to Ukraine. In fact, he was the first president to give lethal aid to Ukraine, and then last year, when he was out of the presidency, he provided crucial political support to enable the Republican-controlled Congress to pass an enormous so-called national security supplemental bill that provided $60+ billion in quote-unquote aid to Ukraine, and almost certainly would never have passed if not for his direct support and the political cover that he provided for the Republicans to go forward with that legislation. So I'm going to keep an open mind in terms of how things are going to pan out. I just frequently find myself urging for people to be a bit more clear-eyed in how they evaluate Trump's policy conduct.
Yeah, no, a lot of good information there, and where you mentioned people like myself and others, I had no idea, that Trump was so influential in that aid bill back then to get it passed. As you said, a massive chunk of money there. And yeah, like the things like Greenland, again, was it a joke? Seemed like a joke. And then he became president, had a meeting or a call with the Danish prime minister, where she was apparently shook after, because he was quite aggressive, in that it wasn't a joke, and they were, he was dead serious that they want Greenland. Whether, again, maybe that was more of a negotiation than the Israeli policy, because at the end of the day, with Israel, he's completely backed by Zionists with money and campaign, with Miriam Adelson giving him 100 million. We have, articles ages and ages ago about, he wants 100 million, she wants the West Bank. And, in his speeches, the good thing about Trump is he is, like you said, if you asked him about it in the campaign, he might have just spilled the beans, because he just opens his mouth, like with Syria, with, we just stayed for the oil. And then the Fox presenter's like, no, not just for the oil, just to protect it. He's like, well, we might take it. Or, when he was on the campaign and he said Sheldon Adelson and Miriam Adelson were in the White House more than anyone. And he gave them, moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He gave them the Golan Heights, which no president had ever done. I gave it to them. I gave away the Golan Heights. I mean, he's always bragged about that. He says how the Israel lobby's not strong enough anymore.
Moved our troops out of Syria on the border between Turkey and Syria. That turned out to be such a successful move, Laura. Look what happened. Now they protect their own. They've been fighting over that border for 1,000 years. Why should we do it? And then they say he left troops in Syria. You know what I did? I left troops to take the oil. I took the oil. The only troops I have are taking the oil. They're protecting the oil. I took over
we're taking the oil. We're not taking the oil.
Well, maybe we will. Maybe we won't.
They're protecting the facility.
I don't know. Maybe we should take it. But we have the oil. Right now, the United States has the oil. So they say he left troops in Syria. No, I got rid of all of them other than we're protecting the oil. We have the oil.
Just as I promised, I recognized Israel's eternal capital and opened the American embassy in Jerusalem. Jerusalem became the capital. I also recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. You know, Miriam and Sheldon would come into the White House probably almost more than anybody outside of people that work there. And they were always after, and as soon as I'd give them something, always for Israel. As soon as I'd give them something, they'd want something else. I'd say, give me a couple of weeks, will you please? But I gave them the Golan Heights, and they never even asked for it. You know, for 72 years, they've been trying to do the Golan Heights, right? And even Sheldon didn't have the nerve. But I said, you know what? I said to David Friedman, give me a quick lesson, like 5 minutes or less on the Golan Heights. And he did. And I said, let's do it. We got it done in about 15 minutes, right? 72 years. You know, for 72 years, it's true. Planes would fly in, fly out, fly in. In the old days, there weren't such nice planes. But they'd fly in every year. They'd have a meeting on the Golan Heights. They'd have lunch. They'd have dinner. They'd have this. They'd have that. They'd leave. Nothing would happen, right? And then one day, Trump came along, and it was done very quickly. 4 years ago, last Sunday, we signed the historic Abraham Accords. It's a big deal. And secured peace in the Middle East. That was peace in the Middle East, really. 4 very strong countries, and we would have had all of the countries signed. We would have had, in my opinion, I know this sounds ridiculous, I believe Iran even would have signed because of all of the benefits and all of the trade and all of the other things. I believe that, but we won't get a chance to see that.
And if you say, let's say 15 years ago, maybe not even that long, anything bad about Israel or Jewish people, you were finished as a politician, right? You were finished. You wouldn't do that, Congressman. You wouldn't do it anyway, but nobody would do it. The most powerful lobby in this country, by far, was Israel and Jewish people. Today, it's almost like, what happened? What happened? What happened to Schumer? What happened to all these people? Schumer's like a Palestinian, right?
He wants to basically make anti-Semitism and campuses illegal, free speech. You know, where's that gone with Israel? So, you know, I don't know how much it is a negotiation. He seemed pretty serious. I mean, he basically shamed the king of Jordan on live TV. That must have been the most awkward interview ever. Not really sure whether it was a good idea or not. But with Israel, what one of the slogans from the Trump supporters would be, because he's a billionaire, he's independent from donations, which isn't true because he's taken loads and loads of donations anyway. Do you truly believe he is actually a Zionist, or he just doesn't care? Like I look at a lot of British brands. I think that's just something more part of the political process for some people. But why do you think Trump is so supportive of Israel? Do you think he sees it as an avenue to power because he may be opposed by? Because at the end of the day, Trump to me is more likable than most other US presidents. He is a bit more of an outsider, although he is a billionaire, and he's still you can hear him talk back in the day. He was friends with the Clintons and obviously Jeffrey Epstein. He's not a complete outsider, but he's not the most liked as we've seen. Do you think he sees getting the Israel lobby on his side as that will get him through? What are your thoughts on why he's so for Israel? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, one of the ironies of Trump's trajectory is that when he first ran for president in 2015, 2016, one of the selling points that attracted a lot of people, in particular Republican and primary voters, and then later on, some measure of independence and whatnot in the general election, was his argument that he couldn't be bought like the traditional politicians he was running against, because there was like 17 people running in the Republican primary in 2016. And so he was distinguishing himself by saying, I'm rich, which people just, burst out into cheers for. And therefore, because I'm so rich, I don't have to kowtow to the donors or the lobbyists or whatever. And that didn't last very long. I mean, for the very beginning of the Republican primary campaign, he did basically eschew going around to the standard donor confabs. But by the time that he had basically sewn up a nomination, he was making the standard appeals to the donor class. And there's one now infamous tweet from November of 2015 where he says that the Adelsons, at that point, Sheldon, who's now sadly departed, they wanted to turn Marco Rubio into their, quote, perfect little puppet. And Trump was going to defy that and not become a puppet of any donor, much less the Adelsons. And then, sure enough, by the time the general election came around in 2016, the Adelsons poured, I think it was $25 million to Trump's campaign. And then by 2020, they obviously loved what he had done in office for the first term, like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, giving a de facto go-ahead for Israeli or Jewish settlements in the West Bank, recognizing the Golan Heights, etc., that they opened the floodgates even further. And I think even in 2020, it was around $100 million that they gave him in the Republican campaign apparatus. And then by 2024, it was a similar number, although I should go double check. I don't know if we know the final number really, because there's so many shady mechanisms now for funds to be dispersed in the American political system, which is another issue. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of the ironies is that these donors have such incredibly outsized influence. I mean, look at Musk. It's not necessarily, he doesn't strictly relate to the issue of Israel in the way that the Adelsons do, but he gave $250 million, and now he's like de facto like running the government or something. I don't even know what his position is. He's a special government advisor or some official government role, and he got that because he poured incredible amounts of money. Now, people will say that they like what he's doing, but there's no doubt that his status as a mega donor is what gained him this access. And that's very much contradictory to how Trump established his reputation as like an outsider or somebody who was going to disrupt the American political system. In some ways, he's more dependent than ever before, than any figure of comparable power on the largesse of these particular mega donors. And in terms of his position on Israel, and one point that I was making throughout the entire campaign, to the chagrin of a lot of people who, for some reason, didn't want to believe it, was that Trump, I think, objectively speaking, you have to say, was running on the most extreme pro-Israel platform of any major party nominee ever. Because what was his message in 2024? It was that Biden and later Harris, despite giving the most unfettered military support to Israel by far of any president ever, was in fact like harboring anti-Semites and saving Hamas and was betraying Israel. And what Trump would do is reverse that supposed betrayal. And he's begun to do that in some fashion by, for example, removing any of the meager restrictions that might have remained on the provision of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, which the Biden administration sent to Israel, but then there was a hold on Israel's ability to use them, is apparently what happened. So even those incredibly meager restrictions are now being removed. And then
also with the settlers as well, he took off the sanctions on the settlers day one.
Yeah, I mean, those were kind of inconsequential anyway, but it does speak to the general policy tendency.
It's symbolism, the symbolism.
Yes, it's symbolic. I mean, and that kind of accelerates a process that began in the first administration when Mike Pompeo, who was then the Secretary of State, was the first senior U.S. official, senior administration official to actually visit and endorse the Jewish settlements in the West Bank and assert that they were not illegal according to the U.S. government. And then, but then Trump does, he does help to facilitate, using his emissaries, the ceasefire framework, which is still tentatively in place. Although Trump, just over this past weekend, for the first time, directly proclaimed that Netanyahu is authorized to blow up the ceasefire arrangement with Trump's full backing, because Trump added a new condition to the ceasefire framework, which is that, according to him, if as of last Saturday, all remaining Israeli hostages or captives were not released, then Israel is fully authorized with full U.S. backing to resume the war. And for him to have announced this Gaza takeover plan also really complicates any continuation of the ceasefire, you would imagine, because why would Hamas voluntarily agree to its own total extirpation, which is what would be entailed by this supposed takeover plan, right? So I don't think that Trump would actually articulate that he himself is a believing or practicing Zionist. I'm not sure if he can even define really what that term means. That would actually be a funny question to ask him. Are you a Zionist? And what does that mean? But he has given refuge to or elevated some of the most hardline extreme elements within Israeli society, such that the Gaza takeover plan, for instance, is much more in line with what people like Ben-Gvir or Smotrich, the genuinely messianic extreme Israeli government ministers, would advocate, and is a few steps to the quote right, if you want to put it on that spectrum, of what Netanyahu probably would be advocating. Because Netanyahu has always been criticized by these genuinely more messianic ministers for not going hard enough in terms of creating a situation where eventually Jewish settlements could resume within Gaza. There's people in Israeli politics who still resent the idea that that the small settlements that were previously in Gaza were evacuated under Ariel Sharon in 2005. They thought that was a historic mistaken capitulation to Islamic extremism, Hamas, whatever. So Trump, unlike virtually any of his predecessors, including George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, they were far more moderate in terms of who they would find themselves in alignment with in Israeli political discourse. In Trump's interregnum period, as I like to call it, between the first and second terms, he was constantly going around being honored by groups like the Zionist Association of America, which is a hardline advocacy group, that gave him like their Theodore Herzl Award, who's one of the founders intellectually of Zionism, and he would host like fundraisers and events at his golf clubs for genuinely messianic hardline groups. One event that he held in July of 2023, the rabbi who was introducing Trump and honoring Trump professed that Trump is this historic figure in Jewish history on the order of King Cyrus, which is actually a common belief within Israel. You can buy a commemorative shekel with Trump's visage emblazoned over that of King Cyrus. And that his greatest wish is that what he prophecies will happen, this was the rabbi speaking, is that Trump will allow for the rebuilding of the third temple in Jerusalem, which is an apocalyptic prophecy that would require basically a religious war, because to rebuild the third temple in Jerusalem, they would have to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is currently on that place where the temple would be rebuilt. So those are the people who are the most enthusiastic about Trump, in my experience. Like when I went to Israel not long after October 7th, the more right-wing person you encountered in terms of their messianic ambitions for a greater Israel type project, the more supportive they were of Trump. And that correlation makes sense given the policy framework that's being set up here. So Trump does defy certain conventions in terms of what traditional U.S. foreign policy had been. And you could give examples like his direct diplomacy with North Korea in the first term. And that has some upsides and downsides. Like I think the taboo against direct engagement with Kim Jong-un was silly, although it doesn't seem to be universally applied, because you could also use that same logic for direct contact with Cuba or Venezuela, which Trump doesn't seem to have much of an appetite for. Or now, I mean, it does defy some convention, perhaps, to have a direct contact with Putin, given everything that's transpired the past 3 years. So that could have some potential upsides, but also some potential dramatic downsides, where it's now seen as like a really impressive, exciting, out-of-the-box solution to do a mass population expulsion from Gaza and turn it into a Gaza-Lago casino Riviera. So, yeah, there's some. So while Trump wouldn't, I think, have any affinity for ideological Zionism, because he just wouldn't know what it is, he does have a very now well-established propensity to elevate people who are on the most extreme spectrum of the Israeli issue, and that includes obviously the so-called Christian Zionists, who one of whom he appointed as ambassador to Israel. That's Mike Huckabee, who is literally a believer in the end times prophecy, which is obviously centered on Jerusalem conveniently for him. And also people like, a pastor, John Hagee, who runs this group, Christians United for Israel, who's a giant Trump supporter and was actually selected by Trump to deliver the opening benediction at the inauguration of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, because according to Hagee, Jerusalem is where Christ will return to rule over earth after the rapture. And he hopes that Trump was going to bring about that apocalyptic scenario. So, yeah, Trump kind of gives safe harbor to these people, even if he doesn't personally espouse or even have familiarity with the underlying kind of ideological or religious beliefs that give rise to them.
Yeah, there was a great documentary called Praying for Armageddon. I'm not sure if you watched it. Lee Fang did it, I think, with Al Jazeera. And it's like a 2-part documentary about Christian evangelicals in the US. The whole reason, a lot of them support Israel so much is because they want Jesus to come back, the end times, Armageddon, and all for the Jews to get slaughtered anyway, And it goes through, obviously, the Trump administration, a lot of their links with Pastor John Hagee, as you mentioned. And then even since then, you had him, during the back and forth with Iran and Israel. He was like, I'm going to Washington to lobby for war because it could bring about the end times. Like, these people lobbying for war so then everyone can die, including the Jews, who it's just like crazy stuff. Like, I mean, we know
Pastor John Hagee, if you actually read some of his books, which I can't say I recommend, but I have read them, he has now come up with this slightly alternative theological outlook where the Jews don't necessarily have to be slaughtered for the end times to occur and for Christ to return, because they've already been saved by virtue of their divine status as God's chosen people. There are differing interpretations of that, I know, but I think Hagee is kind of like moderated over the years, so people can't accuse him of like pining for the mass slaughter of Jews, which would be a little ironic in his case. But even apart from Trump himself, the Republican Party is very reliant on this Christian element. So, like when that national security supplemental bill last year was being proposed and legislated, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who Trump, basically re-empowered as Speaker for this current term, he went around saying that there's a explicit biblical injunction for the United States to send military armaments to Israel. So if a significant section of the Republican Party believes that, then that's like a belief that's not necessarily conducive to standard forms of rational inquiry. It's a religious belief that exists on like a different plane, right? So that's pretty powerful. That's why Netanyahu and his cohort are always very assiduously cultivating the Christian Zionist element in the United States. And so that's a point of kind of leverage or influence over Trump, given his broader coalition, that is potent, even if he, again, himself does not espouse or have that much familiarity with the tenets of the belief.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd love to have you on in the future because I know you've been to the West Bank and you spoke to settlers and you went to Israel. But we've spoken a lot about Israel, and yeah, there's a lot there with the evangelicals. I recommend that documentary. I'll put it on the screen, the show notes. But just going back to Ukraine and the talks, I mean, with Trump, like he does, I do prefer him. I mean, I'm not in America following everything domestically, but foreign policy wise, he definitely does say things much better than presidents. And even if these talks go nowhere, he has actually gone and got people to meet with Putin. He's saying some of the right things. He said, he make a comment about halving the military budget, but then another time saying we need to raise it, saying we need to lower the nuclear weapons. So he does say some of the right things, and he almost seems like he could be a president who goes through with it like in the first time, but then he had the whole Russiagate and framing him as a secret Russian agent. But he says these things, but then I don't think he cares that much. He's not that invested. He's more obviously invested, I guess, in himself. But with this Ukraine policy, I mean, he definitely doesn't hate the Russians like the Biden administration or the UK government, who just seem to be so balls deep in this Ukraine war compared to other European countries. I mean, there's been a lot of good information from Kit Clarenberg on that and the Grey Zone. But I heard recently,
the UK is always like 2 steps ahead of the US in terms of the anti-Russia antagonism. Obviously, they don't have the same amount of power to effectuate that in policy as the US. But it's always like the US is the UK under Boris Johnson and then Truss and then Sunak and now basically under Starmer. They're always like pushing the envelope to some degree within the entire NATO collectivity. I mean, my understanding is that this new proposal for some kind of UK troop deployment to Ukraine for a peacekeeping force, which again, that could be a very interesting euphemism depending on how that shapes out. That was even looked at with skepticism from Poland, which is historically the most virulently antagonistic toward Russia. So, yeah, that's an interesting dynamic with the UK.
Yeah, no, it's
Sorry
scary.
to interrupt.
No, sorry, no, you're right. Because Poland has been like at the start, it was like the UK and Poland were pushing for the tanks, pushing for fighter jets, and then Poland kind of had that argument, that spat with the previous administration with Ukraine.
Right. With
Um,
the MiG jets.
yeah, and then the US sent them like 2 billion, but then the new administration came in with Donald Tusk. But even they backed off. Germany doesn't seem too keen on it. I mean, I don't understand France or Macron. Like at the start of the war, Germany and France, like people just don't remember. Like they was not on board
Right.
with the war. They didn't really want to get involved. They have a much bigger, probably maybe economic relationship. They don't really hate the Russians. Obviously, Germany's gone all in on this now, and France hasn't really gone all in, like weapons wise and money, but like rhetoric, like Macron, I don't know if it's his domestic politics, constantly just saying like he was the first to say stuff like this. But yeah,
Well, I mean, I think Macron is doing this thing where he is trying to evoke de Gaulle and position himself as the leader of Europe, or like presenting himself as an alternative to U.S. primacy over Europe. But in the case of Macron, that alternative is about taking even more bellicose actions vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, rather than figuring out maybe a way to diverge from U.S. militarism, which probably would have been more of the thing about in de Gaulle's era, although there's some nuances there. But yeah, there was one speech that that Macron gave, I think a year and a half or so ago, where he was talking at some forum for Eastern European countries, and he was speaking as though like the Western Europe had to repent and acknowledge that the Eastern European countries had been right all along, and their priorities now deserve to be paramount within the collectivity of Europe. So there's this idea now that as some kind of penitence for France's past inaction, the idea now is to like give this historical reparation almost to the Eastern European countries who have been warning about Russia this whole time, and elevate their priorities. So there's something like that. But yeah, it's kind of like it is sort of like it does seem like at times Macron is on some sort of spiritual quest to revitalize France, which seems like a bit of hubris in a way that's not too dissimilar from past instances of French hubris.
Yeah, I mean, from what Naftali Bennett said, I'm not sure if you've ever watched it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where obviously he specifically said the UK and the US, and specifically Boris Johnson, trashed the peace talks. This is the US's biggest ally. A prime minister was mediating talks between Russia and Ukraine, which I found was quite interesting as well, that relationship there in Istanbul, Turkey, I think. And that, yeah, we came in and trashed it. Boris Johnson, since then, he still denies that, by the way, but he said he's doing an interview with The Telegraph, who are like the most hawkish paper on Ukraine. Keir Starmer wrote.
The Telegraph just constantly has op-eds saying, look, we need to get ready. Look, nuclear war is here. Sorry. I mean, there's always, every time you log on to the Telegraph homepage, there's just always something that's totally berserk in that field.
Yeah, and they're more of a conservative paper, and you have Keir Starmer writes the op-ed for the Telegraph. I mean, come on, like that's just hilarious. But yeah, Boris Johnson, he's in an interview with Telegraph. He's like, scruffy hair, like, come on, mate, this is a proxy war. We're in a proxy war. We're not giving our proxies enough.
The delay on the permissions for the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and the Scarpies and so on, the Germans refusing to give Taurus. I mean, it's been pathetic. I get back to my earlier question. How we are? Let's face it. We're waging a proxy war. We're waging a proxy war, but we're not giving our proxies the ability to do the job. And for years and years now, we've been allowing them to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, and it has been cruel. It has been cruel, and we need now to give them what they need.
I mean, like the UK is all in. But go back to
and it used to be forbidden even to use the term proxy war. I actually don't think that on the merits it's the most accurate term to use. Not because the Ukraine is not being used as a proxy of sorts for the U.S. It is, but I almost view it more as a joint warfare initiative, given how intimately involved the U.S. is in just like targeting decisions, in supplying the resources required for the continuation of the state itself. But there's like operational involvement in terms of the weapon systems and so forth, and the training. That and in terms of the larger kind of like the tactical decision making, where U.S. bases in Germany are the ones calling the shots in terms of what object can be targeted, and U.S. is providing the satellite systems for that. So I almost to me it almost even transcends a proxy fight. It's almost it strikes me as more direct than a proxy fight, but it still is ironic that in the early stages of the war, it really was denounced as Russian disinformation to even use the word proxy war. Like when I was on Fox News when Tucker Carlson was still on, and I used that term. This was like in March of 2022, and I got lambasted by like these liberal media watchdog groups who were saying that I was echoing Putin's propaganda. And now even Boris Johnson himself, who was like the ultimate zealot on this stuff, is conceding to the terminology, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really heard anyone else in a position like that say that. So it was quite interesting to hear him say. I mean, after he stopped being prime minister, he just like became like the de facto ambassador to Ukraine. Like he wasn't, but he was just like visiting there, like just all.
Yeah, there's a street name. Isn't there a street named after him in Kyiv?
No, but yeah, he's.
He went to some kind of like ceremony where they named a street after him.
He's all in. But yeah, just going back to the Ukraine talks, there's one of the people involved. Remind me his name. His surname's Kellogg.
Yeah, Keith Kellogg.
Keith Kellogg, that's it.
General Keith Kellogg.
Yeah, so he was speaking recently about, the US-Russia kind of peace talks or negotiation. And he mentions about, part of this we could use to break, Russia's relationship with North Korea, which he says started more during this war, and, the Iranian weapons that are going there. And also China, and people have started saying, maybe this is their Nixon-Kissinger moment. They're trying to, where they broke off China and the Soviet Union to split them. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen now. It's just too late. There's they've got BRICS. They're creating this new system. Russia, China, well, why would they stop that relationship with the US? But do you think there's something there, like, where they're going to use, they don't even care about Ukraine. They want the minerals, and they're going, you need to break this relationship. This South American country, you leave us alone there. You leave Israel alone if it attacks Iran. Do you think there's a new angle where they're like, Ukraine are losing, they're not going to win. You keep this territory, we get some mineral wealth, and you need to hush down here, and here. Do you think there's any of that, or do you think that's too grand strategy for the modern politicians and Mark Rubio and Trump, things like that?
Well, never put it past politicians to fancy themselves as grand strategists in a very kind of self-idolizing way. So I think that there are people in the administration who would like to think that they can effect a grand strategy whereby a wedge can be driven between China and Russia. But to me, that seems like a fool's errand. I mean, I guess anything is possible, but the idea that Ukraine could be used as like a vessel for trying to detach Russia from China, I don't see how that works in practice. But I do think that would be a goal. Part of the logic that's been used in this proposal around the mineral extraction agreement is that the U.S. needs to do this because otherwise the minerals could end up being seized by China, or they would ultimately like find their way into China's coffers or something, which is like exactly the kind of like block thinking or block conflict instigation that China is always reprimanding the U.S. for. So if this is just a more heavy-handed version of that, I don't see how it necessarily creates the desired divide between China and Russia. It might even enhance it or enhance their connection. But yeah, Keith Kellogg has, they've talked about how, they buy into the new administration, as far as I could tell, buys into this new axis of evil framework, where it's China, Russia, Iran, and then North Korea as like a junior partner. And so the idea, I think, is for the Ukraine negotiations to be sort of wielded to scramble that supposed axis. But it's not that difficult to imagine how that could also backfire, because I don't know, maybe remember, North Korea was open to negotiations that in the first Trump administration that might have theoretically brought them more into the American orbit. And although Trump did defy some contention by having a direct diplomacy with Kim, it was coupled with maximalist demands in terms of North Korean denuclearization and refusal to budge on sanctions and things. So it's unclear that North Korea would even be interested in any kind of U.S. overture to recalibrate its relations with Russia. I mean, that might be too far gone at this point. And North Korea apparently does have some stake in the Ukrainian conflict at this point, although the evidence around their supposed deployment to Ukraine is a bit muddy. But I think it's probably like reasonably well established that even if they were not in Ukraine, like they're on the outskirts in the Kursk area. I'm open to being corrected on that because it is a little bit hazy as to what the facts are. So yeah, but you have to, in terms of Kellogg, you got to remember that these people who are Keith Kellogg, like Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, and others, these guys are from the most hawkish wing, effectively, of the Republican Party, but they're now moderating their tone and rhetoric, which could be commensurate with a real policy shift, but that's not necessarily the case. You have people like Waltz and Kellogg and Rubio who, in the early stages of the Ukraine war, were criticizing the Biden administration for not being aggressive enough in arming Ukraine expeditiously enough. Same with Pete Hegseth, actually. So I'm a little wary that the apparent tonal shift is necessarily going to indicate an underlying policy shift. It might, but I think people need to be kind of on the lookout for evaluating how well the rhetoric matches up with the underlying policy, because if the U.S. is now just like wanting to use Ukraine as almost a new form of battering ram to break up Russia's geopolitical position, it's not hard to see that backfiring. Even before the Ukraine war, the Biden administration was negotiating with Russia. They just, so it's not like negotiations or the resumption of direct contact necessarily precludes some kind of growth of conflict. It's just kind of like the basic first step to attempt to preclude it. So we shall see.
Yeah, no, I'd recommend people to go to your Twitter feed because you've got loads of videos of the Trump administration before it went into the presidency, of them talking about the Ukraine war, being more hawkish, saying we need to give them the long-range missiles that we now have, obviously through Biden, and we need to sanction them more. And Marco Rubio, he's clearly was all on board with it. So yeah, you are right. It is a tone shift. So we'll see. I mean, there's obviously some of the Republican base who see China as the priority. So who knows where this is going. You're definitely right. Everything the US seems to do. A lot of people complain and are scared of the new BRICS world potentially coming and the ending of Western domination. But then don't stop for 1 second to ask why that happened. Since the end of the Cold War, we had a good chance to bring Russia into the European side, and we blew it. And nothing sums it up better than Biden in 1997 at the Atlantic Council talking about the Baltic states, if they was admitted to NATO, and Russia wouldn't like this, but what are they going to do? They're going to run to Iran or China? Nah.
I think the one place where the greatest consternation would be caused in the short term for admission, having nothing to do with the merit and preparedness of the country to come in, would be to admit the Baltic states now in terms of NATO-Russian, U.S.-Russian relations. And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction, I don't mean military.
Well,
And Trump has taken an extremely hard line against BRICS, rhetorically anyway. He's saying that he's going to use like maximalist economic warfare to ensure that there's no rival currency to the US dollar established by BRICS, which was probably kind of an implausible thing anyway. I mean, I think people kind of overstate the significance of BRICS in certain ways, having gone to the BRICS summit myself recently. It's kind of like a format for various countries to like gather and chat. Like it's not a military alliance or anything even approximating that. That said,
what about de-dollarization? Do you think that is the most significant part of it? Because I mean, I'm open to, again, your line of thinking that, it's going to be a lot harder than maybe people say to upend the US. But what about, these current countries using their own currencies and kind of building a different sanction-proof, like Marco Rubio was on TV, like, these countries, eventually we're not going to be able to sanction them because, so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I just don't see much progress toward that end. And Trump has declared that one of his main that he will ensure that rival currency cannot be established by exerting maximum economic pressure on the BRICS countries. So, I mean, economic warfare can often be a precursor to kinetic warfare. So that's something to bear in mind, given Trump's very liberal use of sanctions. I don't buy the idea that sanctions are somehow like an obvious alternative to warfare, to kinetic warfare. Oftentimes they are they go hand in hand. And so I don't see the BRICS countries reacting especially favorably to that. And then also just on terms of some kind of Ukraine settlement potentially being in the offing, the Middle East actually is sort of a factor here, because if Trump pursues a takeover, quote unquote, of Gaza, and that inflames the region, including Iran, given the apparent military partnership that's been intensifying between Russia and Iran, that could be a factor in terms of how much reliability they judge the U.S. to have to be like a broker in Ukraine. So that's another variable there that I think is maybe underrated. Like these things tend to be interconnected, which is worrisome in terms of potentially creating a foundation for some kind of world war scenario. But nonetheless, there is an interconnectivity there that I think is worth being cognizant of.
I mean, you've given me plenty of time. Are you happy me to ask you one more question just about Elon Musk? I was just curious to know your thoughts. But
yeah, one more is good.
Yeah. With Elon Musk, I mean, from my view, I think he's just overly rated with what he is. He's obviously jumped on the Trump wagon, and a lot of people liked him because he's gone on Joe Rogan. But I mean, it's hard not to see him in my eyes as a billionaire, one of the biggest in the world, a military contractor with the US, had his own space company. He gets government subsidies through his companies. He, had his own brain chip company that seems to work quite similar to DARPA. And I just find it hard to take him serious. I mean, he comes across very autistic, and then he seems to put out these tweets constantly all day that come off quite well. And then I watch him in an interview, and I'm like, this guy's really hard to watch. I remember when he did the first Joe Rogan, like, I'd watched it because, he's quite a cool guy. But I found it so hard to watch. But then he's got a bit better, don't get me wrong, except, the Nazi salute. That obviously wasn't a Nazi salute. But yeah, I just don't know why people love him so much. But he's constantly putting out tweets. Like he's ruined Twitter for me. It's just constantly he's on my feed.
Yeah.
During there's a lot of culture war stuff going on in the UK with immigration, and more specifically with Muslims. And I mean, can't just keep letting illegal immigrants in. But there's a lot of culture war with the grooming gangs. And my feed during that would just have like nothing. I'm constantly, looking at stuff, foreign policy, and it was just constant him boosting, obviously, certain accounts and himself, while apparently he runs all of these companies. But I find it hard to see him as this person out of step with the establishment when he's a military contractor. So I just wondered your thoughts on him. Is he like playing a game? He's trying to be like this kind of villain against the Starmer in the EU. He's kind of, I don't know, it all feels very pantomime-y. He obviously said some sort of things against the ADL and kind of Jews agenda with immigration on the south border. Straight after that, he does a tour around Auschwitz with Netanyahu, and now he was his special
and Ben
guest.
Shapiro.
Yeah, he was his special guest when Netanyahu did a speech. He's just kind of turned into Israel's bitch. Whether he may, believe in Israel as the project as well, I don't know. But what are your thoughts on Elon Musk? Because everyone seems to love him, can't get enough of him. I just can't get over that he's just a military contractor. I mean, he put up Starlink in Ukraine. Whether he pulled it or not, I don't know. It's just really hard to take the guy serious. And his tweets just don't match up to his behavior. I see him like Bill Gates. They're just very awkward, clever, tech, nerdy people.
Well, I resent that Twitter/X has now just become his 24/7 kind of propaganda bullhorn. And it basically is now just a constant like Musk drama information delivery system, whether it's his personal issues or his political activities. It has diminished the utility of the platform for me somewhat, because it's impossible to really filter out. Even if you like block or mute him potentially, it's still like he's always the topic of the day. And it's just kind of annoying because like I have used Twitter/X regularly since 2009. So that's a long time. And, it's been useful for me in lots of ways over the years. And there's still some uses to it, but I just find the clutter he causes is just all consuming. And that actually gets back to what we were talking about early on with how the media landscape has evolved. I do think that his purchasing Twitter and making it into X, and then giving that platform a much more stark kind of right-wing tinge did have a big influence on things. And the fact that X is so seems to be so singularly devoted to just churning out pro-administration content day after day, and that's what gets the biggest algorithmic boost. Maybe in part to some finagling with the code or whatever, but also I guess because a lot of people who are left or liberal have left the platform is it's like a worrisome echo chamber type dynamic that he's cultivating. And then also, I mean, he's just constantly putting out bullshit. Like the one of the big examples of fraud that he supposedly uncovered was the $50 million in condoms to Gaza. And then that turned out to actually be Mozambique, like a province of Mozambique, which is also named Gaza. But like, why is it that they felt that that was one of the most significant instances of supposed fraud that they needed to publicize? Well, it was probably in keeping with his and the administration's broader position on Israel, where they wanted to like claim that the Biden administration was funding Hamas by giving them condoms that could be weaponized to attack the IDF or something. So that was an insight into his, I think, thinking in terms of the actual fraud that they're trying to ferret out. And then just he's putting out stuff about how like social. He was like last week and then into this week he was talking about how his Doge whiz kids found out that there's this suspicious number of supposed 150-year-olds who are getting Social Security payments, but it's just like a total misrepresentation of the spreadsheet he got, and there aren't actually like supposed 150-year-olds who are receiving Social Security payments. So I think, they want to do a form of austerity for a lot of pre-existing government programs that probably is not going to extend to the Pentagon, except insofar as the supposed cuts to the Pentagon that they're going to emphasize are programs around diversity or gender or whatever, which obviously does not get into the meat of what the Pentagon does, but then maybe that could get heralded as them actually doing cuts to the defense budget, which is like totally almost immaterial. I'm not going to bemoan these stupid diversity or gender programs being taken out of the Defense Department necessarily, because they are ridiculous, but they're taking them out, or they're emphasizing them because they think that they're an impediment to U.S. war fighting, not as some kind of principled commitment to reducing the expenditures of the military industrial complex, of which, as you mentioned, Musk is a personal beneficiary as a contractor. So, yeah, I mean, it's a mixed bag. I mean, it's hard to object in principle to just somebody updating the technological systems of the federal government, because it does run on antiquated technology in a lot of cases, and evaluating every expenditure. But like, it's just such a tsunami of bullshit that it makes you wonder, like, what is the actual intent here? Like, and what programs are they really looking to cut? Like, it's a bit odd that one of the first priorities was the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, which I'm not a huge expert on, but I think it's pretty well established that, for example, that was an agency that had done some regulations around credit card companies, so people couldn't get stiffed as easily on like overdraft fees and things. And if your intent is to bring savings to the government, then to shutter that particular agency in the name of savings is a little strange. USAID clearly does have a lot of fluff, but if ultimately that's just going to be reorganized into the State Department, and they're going to cut out the extraneous like LGBT initiatives, how much savings is that really producing? And is the core functionality of USAID to kind of project American soft power, is that still going to be in place after Musk is through with it? Hard to say, but the drama and the cacophony of bullshit I do find a bit tiresome.
Yeah, I mean, obviously with Twitter you can move to the section where you follow only and go for your feed that way. But I like the recommended, because you get people you don't follow, and then you're like, oh, I'm gonna follow this guy. Like, I didn't follow you. I probably found you through Scott Horton or someone, but now I'm just getting these people I'm never gonna follow, nothing to do with what I care about. I found it strange as well that, I mean, he's obviously bought this platform, he's abusing it, using it to his own, agenda. I mean, he was meddling in Venezuelan elections as well, putting stuff out about that. But like, if he was really serious about free speech and breaking up big tech, he didn't have to buy Twitter. He could have just left Twitter and gone, I'm going to make my own new platform. I've got the money. I'm going to build it. He's got the platform. Come over here, and then you can slightly break up the monopoly. I'm not saying he had to do that, but he decided to buy a pre-existing tech company. And
and also every other day he reveals another example of his, let's say, questionable commitment to free speech. Like, that's a convenient slogan for people on the right to use, and insofar as it does instill a genuine commitment to free speech, I'm all for it. But when he's calling for the imprisonment of like a TV news outlet because he doesn't like how they edited an interview with Donald Trump, or a week or two ago when he was saying that somebody who posted the names of Doge employees who were government employees were committing a criminal violation, it makes you wonder how sincere the supposed commitment to free speech is, or whether it's just kind of a fig leaf that once he attains power will fall by the wayside and just be used to essentially punish enemies. So, which would not be the most welcome development.
Last question, is it only a short one? Did you ever see his tweet? Because I didn't see it in real time. I've only seen screenshots. It wouldn't surprise me if it's true. But he said, like, replying to something about the attempted coup in Bolivia, where he said, we will coup who we want. Obviously, he has a lot of investment with lithium. They have a lot of lithium there. Did you see it in live time? Did you? Because it's just like, as much as probably true, I can't really verify a screenshot. Lots of people reported it at the time. Did you ever see it?
I vaguely recall it. I can't say that I remember with enough specificity to verify whether it was true, but it wouldn't surprise me either. Because he had a similar attitude toward Venezuela last summer, I think it was, where he was agitating for a regime change there.
Yeah, questioning the election, saying it needs to be done again, he needs to step down. Yeah. Well, you've given me plenty of time. You've given me time over. I really appreciate your time. Everything we talk about will go in the show notes. I'll put it up on the screen. I'll put, obviously, your Substack, your Twitter, and everything. But yeah, thanks for coming on. I just really appreciate your time and your work. And I'd love to have you on again to speak about kind of your time in the West Bank if you're happy to. But I know you're a busy man. So, but yeah, it was just really good to finally speak to you.
All right. Yeah, I enjoyed it.